Steel City. Is everybody ready to go? Let's proclaim the greatest radio show.
Welcome, fans, to one of the most exciting segments I've done in a long time. I'm your host, Jim Sella, in studio with co-host Jay Dash. We're breaking into fantasy football for the year 2015. We're going to rank the top 25 players from you, Dash.
Yep.
All you.
We're going to do 25, and then we'll have 26 through 50 in another segment, so go check that out after we're done here. And it's going to be PPR rankings. Make sure you know that.
And this is going to be a quick overview. We will be going more in-depth to these players week to week as the season comes up and as the season goes on. So just keep coming back for more fantasy knowledge.
Let's start with the number one player here. It's going to be a running back from the Pittsburgh Steelers, Le'Veon Bell.
Le'Veon.
You look what he did last year. 1,361 yards rushing with 8 rushing touchdowns. He had 83 receptions for 854 yards and 3 touchdowns in the air. That's really what puts him over the top here, is those 83 receptions he had. Really, there's not another running back in football that did what he did last season, and really, he is what LaShawn McCoy used to be to the NFL. And if you look, he had 4 100-yard games, including 204 yards at Tennessee, 185 yards at Cincinnati. He had a 100-yard receiving game with 159 yards versus New Orleans. He had 5 or more receptions 12 times last season, 7 rushing TDs over his final 6 games. You remember early in the season he wasn't getting in the end zone as much on the ground. But he does have that 2-game suspension.
Believe it.
But here's the thing. I don't really care about the suspension. If you're worried about the suspension, go grab D'Angelo Williams late in the draft or something. But there will be other running backs late in the draft that you can fill in for the first 2 weeks of the season. But this offense, really, it's the exact same offense as last season, but they were a young group. I mean, Martavis Bryant, Marcus Wheaton, these guys should be growing in this offense. So I only see this offense getting better this season than they were last year. But I also don't expect them to feed Le'Veon Bell the ball as much as they did last season.
Now his receptions will go down a little bit. His rushing yards will probably go up maybe a little bit. I wouldn't be surprised to see him get about 1,500 yards rushing. I think the big thing is with the reduced catches, you may see a couple more rushing TDs. The Steelers are really focusing on that red zone offense this year. So I don't see any drop-off in points. It'll just be a little different how he gets them.
Yeah, I see more offensive points for the Steelers overall and more for Le'Veon Bell in turn. But like I said, that 2-game suspension, I wouldn't worry about it. And here's why. Jamal Charles, my second pick overall, running back for Kansas City. He was actually terrible through the first 2 games last season, so he pretty much gave you nothing anyways, and he turned out to be one of the best fantasy running backs anyways. I mean, he had 1,033 yards rushing with 9 rushing touchdowns, 59 receptions for 291 receiving yards with 5 receiving touchdowns. You see, though, the big drop-off, 291 receiving yards compared to Le'Veon Bell, who had 854.
Jamal Charles had more touchdown catches than the wide receivers as a group.
Oh, please believe. But that's another thing. They brought in some receivers this year, including Jeremy Maclin. So the passing game should be a little bit better. And in turn, the defenses won't be able to stick 8-9 in the box just to stop Jamal Charles. So that should open things up for Charles as well.
Yeah, anything that gets those safeties to be a couple yards further back off the line of scrimmage will help Jamal. He's real good in space. He may not get all the catches because the wide receivers are better, but he'll get more yards on the ground for sure. And he's a guy that can get yards after contact too, so if he makes that first guy miss, you better watch out.
Some of the things he did last season, he had 1 100-yard rushing game. It was 159 yards versus Seattle of all teams. He had 7 80-yard rushing games, though, so you can see he was still getting the rushing yards. And KC had a 5-game winning streak from October 19th to November 16th, and Charles had all 3 of his 20-plus carry games and scored 7 rushing touchdowns during that span. So you can see the best way for this team to win is give Jamal Charles the ball, and I think they know that. And even though their passing game will get better this season, they still know they got to feed Jamal Charles if they want to win football games.
Believe it. Andy Reid knows how to use them.
My number 3 running back, this is tough because the guy hasn't played in a while, but Adrian Peterson of the Minnesota Vikings. Last season,
scary number 3 guy for me.
Listen, on most people's boards, he's number 1 overall. And listen, he is very talented, obviously, and really there isn't a lot of dominant running backs in the game, and if he turns out anything like he was before this suspension, I mean, this is going to be a steal at number 3, actually. But last season, just 21 carries for 75 yards, obviously due to the suspension. But you look, the combination of Matt Asiata and Jerick McKinnon last season, they still put up some big games for him. And you look at Peterson's numbers in 2013, 1,266 rushing yards, 10 rushing touchdowns. Now, he wasn't a huge factor in the passing game, 29 receptions, 171 receiving yards, and a touchdown. But he had 5 100-yard games, including 4 140-yard games. But like I said, he wasn't a big factor in the passing game. He only had 10 yards receiving over the 6 final games of 2013. So this is a guy that has to get it done on the ground. And really with Teddy Bridgewater, obviously, that is going to help bring in Adrian Peterson back. It's going to help the growth of Bridgewater. And if Bridgewater has any improvement in the passing game this season, it's only going to help Adrian Peterson in his running game as well.
Well, Minnesota brought in Mike Wallace, and just like we said, with Jamal Charles, Wallace is going to challenge those safeties deep on almost every play that he's out there. They're going to have to recognize that he's out there, even if it's not a play going anywhere near him. So that's going to open some things up for Peterson. Although Peterson is 30 years old now, and generally running backs have peaked by the time they're 30 years old.
That's what's scary, and that's why I'm not taking him number 1. I'm going to stick with Le'Veon Bell, who's the best running back in the game now, and Jamal Charles, who has been just as reliable as Adrian Peterson, really, although not as big of numbers.
I don't want to say complete less is more for Peterson, because I'm not saying take away, but in his instance, he doesn't need 400 touches. Give him 300 touches, and I think you'll get more production out of him. He's getting old. You don't want to have to give him all those touches, because then his production will start to drop, I feel.
All right, number 4, running back for Green Bay, Eddie Lacy.
Lacy has been battling a little bit of a foot injury, but nothing serious. He's probably going to have foot issues his whole career. It's just one of those nagging injuries for one of those guys.
Well, you look, 2014 was a big season for Lacy, and really his breakout year. He had 1,139 yards rushing, 9 rushing touchdowns, 42 receptions for 429 receiving yards, and 4 touchdowns in the air as well. So you could see he was used pretty heavily in the passing game. He had a slow start to the season in 2014. He only had 161 yards and 1 touchdown through the first 4 games of the season, too. So most of this production came over the final 12 games of the season. Now, he had 97 or more yards rushing in 5 of his last 6 games, and he had 9 of his 13 total touchdowns over the final 8 games of the season. So he came on very strong over the second half of the season, and really that's why he is one of the top running back choices here in fantasy this season.
Is it because it gets colder in Green Bay, so they start using them more later in the year, maybe?
Well, I mean, that's a reason for nearly every running back having bigger stats later in the season, and sometimes wide receiver stats go down later in the season. But, I mean, Green Bay, this offense, they're still one of the elite offenses in football, and they're going to have a huge passing game, and that's going to keep things open for Eddie Lacy. And really, like I said, in the passing game, he's been used heavily last season as well. So Eddie Lacy is a great number 1 running back to have in fantasy this season.
I still am glad the Steelers took Bell instead of Lacy.
Oh, yeah, me too right now, but I still say Eddie Lacy could have the longer career. I mean, just look at LaShawn McCoy right now. I think he is starting to fall off a little bit as the wear and tear of NFL gets to him.
I think McCoy's going to have a big year in Buffalo.
Well, I hope you draft him then, because I really don't want to.
I
but
will.
Let's move to number 5 here, Marshawn Lynch from the Seattle Seahawks.
Beast mode.
Yeah, this is an older guy like you were talking about. They break down, but Marshawn Lynch has been one of those guys that has not broke down over the years. And last year, 1,306 yards rushing, 13 rushing TDs, 37 receptions for 367 yards with 4 receiving touchdowns.
And the one carry he didn't get is the one that he should have got. Oh, in your face! In your face, Seattle! I hate you!
So you wanted New England to win?
No, I wanted it to end at a tie.
Well, that's not going to happen, though.
I know. It was horrible.
But Lynch, he had 5 100-yard games last season, including 140 yards against the Giants. He had at least 60 yards rushing in all but 3 games last season. He had 86 or more yards rushing in 6 of his last 8 games, and also had a very strong playoff run. He had 5 multi-TD games, and that includes receiving touchdowns. And he had 20 or more carries 8 times, including 6 times in the last 9 games of the season, and 5 or more receptions 3 times. And really, they don't have a backup that compares to him, and he's still going to be a featured back, and that's hard to find in the NFL. So Marshawn Lynch, again, another season as a first-round pick in fantasy football.
Any chance they maybe, I'm not saying shy away from him because he'll still have a big year, but start that transition towards running the offense more around Russell Wilson, knowing that this will be Lynch's last year probably, and Wilson just got the big deal?
I don't know. I mean, they did bring in Jimmy Graham to help the passing game, but I don't see them staying away from Lynch really at all, especially if this is his last season in Seattle. I expect them to run him into the ground and try to win another championship.
Hopefully he didn't eat too many Skittles in the offseason.
Number 6, we're going to go with our first wide receiver here. So the first 6 running backs, that's the 6 elite running backs. And then you want to turn to the top wide receiver in the draft, Antonio Brown of the Pittsburgh Steelers. Last season, he was dominant. 129 receptions on 182 targets, 1,698 yards with 13 touchdowns.
I'm surprised AB's at number 6.
Why is that?
Because he's number 1 in our hearts.
I'm sure non-Steeler fans don't think that way.
Oh, fantasy players, he's number 1 in their heart. He had a huge year last year.
Well, listen, he's the most consistent wide receiver in the game, too, and that's really what makes me think of him as the number 1 wide receiver. Not because he had the big year, because a lot of receivers have big years, but this guy had a big week every single week, and really, over the past 2 seasons,
50.
Yeah, 5 for 55, I believe it is, or is it just 5 for 50? But either way, yeah, at least 5 receptions and 50-some yards every game for 32 straight games. That's reliability, and that's exactly what you want in your fantasy lineup. Last season, he had 7 or more receptions 14 times, 100 or more yards 8 times, 90 or more yards 13 times, and no less than 72 yards in any game. 4 multi-touchdown games. So this guy was dominant. And I know Kelvin Johnson may be the better talent in the end, but Antonio Brown's the most consistent. And like I said, the Steelers' offense is going to get better this year because they're bringing back the same players. They're a year older. There's more chemistry on this team. I mean, the offense said they want to score 30 points as a team this season. Now, they only scored like 23 last year. Do I think they're going to score 30? No, but they are going to score more points this year. Antonio Brown is going to be a big part of that.
I might put him ahead of Lacey just because I don't like him. Block you, Lacey.
All right, let's move on to our number 7 guy here. Denver running back, C.J. Anderson. This is a guy that was not the feature back the entire season, but when he finally did become the feature back, he dominated. He ended up with 849 yards rushing, 8 rushing touchdowns, 34 receptions for 139 yards and a receiving touchdown. He had just 17 carries through the first 7 games of the season, so you see he wasn't being used much early in the season, but he had 335 yards rushing between weeks 12 and 13 versus Miami and KC respectively. He had 83 or more yards rushing in each of the last 6 games of the season. He had all 8 rushing touchdowns over the final 6 weeks of the season. 30 receptions over the final 8 games of the season, and the Broncos were 4-0 when Anderson had 20 or more carries. So this is going to be their feature back this season. And I mean, yes, they lost Julius Thomas, but this is still going to be a very good offense in the end. And Peyton Manning, he's going to take a step down possibly, but it's not going to be as big as you think, man.
No, Manning's not going to throw the ball only 400 times this year. He's still going to throw the ball 500 times, but you'll see Anderson definitely get carries earlier in the year. They're going to want to save Peyton for the end of the season and playoff time. So I think the focus will be more on the running game. With Gary Kubiak out there, he runs the stretch offense a lot like Peyton did in his early years in Indianapolis. And I think Anderson fits that type of running back to run that system.
Listen, if this guy had more than a half a season of good stats under his belt, I would put him up here in the top 5 running backs. It's just I haven't seen a full season out of him yet, so there's still a little bit of question marks about him. But this guy, I said it last year as soon as he started becoming the feature back that he was going to be a beast. You could just see how he runs. This guy is a monster. All right, let's move on to number 8 here. Philadelphia Eagles running back DeMarco Murray.
I'm surprised Murray's not a little higher up on your running backs list. He led the league in rushing last year, and he's going to a team that's definitely going to feature him in the offense.
They are going to feature him, but look, Dallas's offensive line wasn't too bad last season, where Philadelphia's offensive line, and it showed with LaShawn McCoy's season, he didn't have the biggest season last year. Philadelphia's line wasn't very good last season, and there's also the fact that DeMarco Murray was overused. Listen, he had 1,845 yards rushing, 13 rushing touchdowns, 57 receptions for 416 yards, but he had more carries than anyone in football, and you know, a season later they usually take a step back.
When you touch the ball 400 plus times in a season, even if the playoffs are involved in those totals, you generally take a step back the next year. It's hard for your body to come up with that again.
I mean, look at this, man. Like I said, he had 57 catches. He had 392 carries and plus 40 carries in the playoffs. So there's 432 carries, 57 receptions. You're almost 500 touches during the season. You're going to take a step down. But look, Philly's offense, I know you don't like him this season, you said.
He's going to split, not time with Ryan Matthews, but he's not. Ryan Matthews will get some of the carries too.
Oh, definitely. And they got Darren Sproles out there who will probably get some playing time as well. You don't like Darren Sproles?
I think he's going to be phased out. I like him.
Oh,
I just think he's going to be phased out.
He's not going to be phased out, man. He's definitely going to be used in the passing game as well. But I don't know if DeMarco Murray's going to be used in the passing game like he was in Dallas either. That's another thing. Is he going to have 57 receptions this season? That's a big question. But still, DeMarco Murray is still a first-round pick in fantasy. You look, last season, 7 touchdowns through the first 7 games before a 4-game scoring drought, but then he scored 6 TDs over his last 5 games. So he ended strong. He had 12 100-yard games, including each of the first 8 games. He had 179 yards at Chicago on December 4th. He had 4 140-yard games, 5 games with 6 receptions or more, 5 lost fumbles in the first 8 games, but he had 0 over the last 8 games, so he shored that up. He had 20 or more carries 13 times, though, and that's the biggest thing that scares me. His overusage last season.
He's still going to
He's still going to have a good season, but it's not going to be the same season he had last year. In fact, I mean, coming into the season last year, no one even thought DeMarco Murray was the best running back in football, and I'm sure people don't think that.
Big on Murray to begin with.
Well, I mean, he's a good running back.
Yeah, I'm just saying I've never thought he was a top 3 back, more of a top 10 back.
Yeah, I agree. All right, let's move on to number 9 here.
One of the top running backs for a long time in fantasy football.
Yeah, Matt Forte for the Chicago Bears. Now, here's the thing.
He's old.
It's hard. Chicago does a lot of passing, too, and as you can see, he had 102 receptions last season.
And he doesn't want that this year. I read an article. Yeah. He said he wants the carries. He doesn't want to be featured in the running game. He doesn't want to lose the touches. He just wants to be a running back. It's for the offense's own good. He's not saying he doesn't want to do it. He thinks the offense will be more successful if they're throwing downfield and then allowing him to take advantage of the underneath and the open space with the safeties back off the line.
Well, look, he had 800 yards receiving too and 4 touchdowns through the air. But they weren't a good running team last year. So while his catches are going to go down, you're right. But giving him more carries, that's not going to make this team much better, in my opinion. They're going to have a hard time running. And his numbers, his rushing yards might go up. I don't know if his rushing TDs are going to go up at all, though. And I think he's just going to have not a down season. He's still going to be a top 10 running back in fantasy, but he's not going to put up the same numbers he did last season.
I disagree a little slightly. I do agree that he's not going to put up the receptions, but I think the points in fantasy and the touchdowns are going to be there because John Fox is the coach in Chicago now, and Fox loves Forte, and he loves what he brings to the game, and Fox has always had a pretty good running team. Even when he was in Denver, they didn't run a lot, but they ran fairly successfully.
Well, how many catches do you think he can come up with this year?
Forte? Yeah. I think he's looking more around 50 to 60 catches. But he wants, around 40 more carries, maybe 50 more carries. So he wants to be a running back, and then catch some passes out of the backfield.
See, that's where I'm saying, though. Do you think he's going to score more than 10 touchdowns total?
I think he can. I think he can almost score 10 rushing touchdowns this year.
Okay, yeah, but then they're going to go down in the passing game.
Well, if he runs for 10 and catches 3 or 4, I mean that's
if you're taking 100 catches, cutting that in half to 50 catches, you're expecting something like 2 touchdowns, correct?
Depends on where you're throwing him the football.
Well, I'm just saying, in terms of average here, let's say he scores 12 touchdowns instead of 10 next season, and he rushes for another. What, you said 40 more carries, so another 200 yards, we'll say. We'll give him credit for 200 yards. That's 20 points there, plus 2 more touchdowns is 12 points. That's 32 points in those categories, but you're taking 50 points off the catches. So he's actually going to go down in terms of fantasy value. Now, he may be more valuable to the Chicago Bears, but his fantasy value isn't going to be as good as it is last season if his catches go down like we both believe they will. But you look last season, 3 100-yard rushing games, so he still came up with a few 100-yard rushing games. He had 122 versus Green Bay, 20 or more carries just 3 times, though, 5 or more receptions in all but 2 games, so he was used heavily in the passing game. He had 8 receptions or more 5 times. He had 2 games with double-digit receptions, and he had a 100-yard receiving game too. But he did not score through the first 4 games of the season, but he had 10 over his final 12 games. So he did score all his touchdowns over the final 12 games, you see. And he scored at least 1 TD in 7 different games of the season. So he was pretty consistent fantasy-wise. Like I said, somewhat of a downgrade for him this season. He's usually a top 5 pick. This year, I'm going to have him sitting at number 9. So he's still a first-round fantasy running back, in my opinion. I'm not hating on Matt Forte. Just not quite as good of a season as last year.
We'll slightly disagree there.
All right, let's move on to number 10. LaShawn McCoy from the Buffalo Bills.
Your boy. You love this guy.
I don't hate McCoy. He was my first-round pick last season.
The only guy you follow on Twitter.
You're dead wrong. I don't even have Twitter. But he had 1,319 yards rushing last season, but only 5 rushing touchdowns, and he wasn't used in the passing game like he was in his past. Just 28 receptions for 155 yards receiving and no receiving touchdowns. Is he going to be used in the passing game in Buffalo, though, with E.J. Manuel? We'll have to see how that works out as well, man. But he had 20 or more carries 9 times. He had 4 100-yard rushing games, including 159 at Dallas, 149 versus the Giants. He had 74 or more yards rushing 11 times, and 4 of his 5 rushing TD came over the final 8 games of the season. So he did get a little better towards the end of the season. I mean, early in the season, people were calling him a fantasy bust, but he ended up being a pretty good running back anyways. But, I mean, man, they still got Fred Jackson out there, and they're going to be using him as well. And really, there hasn't been a good fantasy running back in Buffalo for a pretty long time now.
I don't know. I had Fred Jackson a couple of years. He put up some pretty beast
yeah, they have big games here and there, man, but there's no one you can really trust. I mean,
there's a new regime up in Buffalo, too. You got Rex Ryan, who has literally run the ball 50-plus times in a game if he thinks his quarterback can't win it for him, and the quarterback position is shaky. So I could see McCoy getting buttloads of carries. Now, will that turn into yards and points? That's still to be seen because they could run him into the ground. His skills could be diminishing and stuff like that. But I see LaShawn McCoy getting all the opportunity to put up the points because he's going to be the only one that Rex Ryan believes in that offense.
Yeah, here's my problem with that, though. Buffalo, you're right, it's a new regime. But last year, their leading running back only had 525 yards, and that was Fred Jackson. Then you look at the New York Jets, where Rex Ryan was. He's had no run game for fantasy value in a long time. I mean, Thomas Jones was a decent running back in fantasy, never
he
a
had
stud
a
running
back like McCoy either, though.
But McCoy, I'm telling you, man, he's not the same running back he used to be. He doesn't have that explosiveness he's still a top 10 running back, don't get me wrong, but he's not like he was when he was 23 and 24 years old. He has slowed down just a step. I still agree you should take him in the first round, but I have a hard time believing he is going to dominate in Buffalo.
I wouldn't be shocked if he ended up as a top 2 back by the end of the year. And I'm not hating on you or anything like that. I'm just saying I think McCoy still has it in the tank. And I think he's going to get all the shots in Buffalo that he can take. And if they got nobody, man. They got nobody at quarterback to get the ball to the wide receivers.
They don't, and that scares me too. You've seen what happened last season with Philadelphia. Their line wasn't very good, so he didn't get much. If teams are stacking the box against Buffalo, it's going to be tough for McCoy to find room, and they're going to have to use him more in the passing game if he's going to be a good fantasy player for him, because 28 receptions isn't going to get it done.
The touchdowns will be there. 22.
Now you're talking about Buffalo scoring a bunch of touchdowns. Let's move on to number 11 here. I'm going to have Rob Gronkowski.
New contract this year.
Yeah, the New England Patriots tight end, obviously. Now, there's the one problem. Tom Brady's not going to be around the first 4 weeks. But you look around me, and there is no other tight end you can really trust. There was
bad quarterbacks like to throw to their tight end, too, so Garoppolo will be using him as a crutch, I think.
Yeah, that's a possibility. And, I mean, you could say the same thing about Julius Thomas going to Jacksonville as well.
Yeah, with Blake Bortles.
But do you trust Julius Thomas as a top 50, even top 50 pick anymore? How about Jimmy Graham in Seattle? I mean, that's a little bit better situation, but do you trust it 100% where you're going to pass Gronk up and wait?
No, I wouldn't pass up Gronk for Graham because you don't know with Graham being in a new offense.
That's what I'm saying.
Gronk
That's why I have Gronkowski.
The number one tight end.
Yes, there's no question about it. You look, he had 130 targets last year, wound up with 82 catches, 1,124 yards and 12 touchdowns. He had 5 or more receptions 9 times, 3 100-yard games, including 149 versus Chicago. He also had 94 yards at Buffalo, 98 yards at Green Bay, and 96 yards at Miami. So he almost had 6 100-yard games. He had double-digit targets 8 times and at least 8 targets 3 other times. He scored a TD in all but 5 games. He scored 8 touchdowns over his final 8 games of the season. Like I said, he's going to be without Brady, but with the question marks of the other 2 top tight end from last season, Julius Thomas and Jimmy Graham, there's no one else out there that you can completely trust. And when you get Tom Brady back, then you're money.
Money in the bizag. One thing I want to say about Gronk is, pluck you, Gronk, because I took a flyer on you one year coming off an injury. You had like one good game for me. I got all jacked up, and then you were garbage the rest of this year, or that year. It won't happen this year, but still, pluck you, Gronk.
I'm trusting Gronk this year. Although there is the one question about Tom Brady. You remember last season, his first 4 or 5 games, he had trouble, and a lot of people actually dropped him in fantasy because he wasn't a good player. Now, let's say he misses 4 games and he has 4 poor games to start the season. You're talking about going into week 9, week 10 with questions about Tom Brady. So it could be a down season for the Patriots in terms of fantasy, but I think Gronk, he's going to get thrown to a lot by Garoppolo, and Tom Brady, even if he does struggle, he's going to find a way to get Gronkowski the ball.
I want to point out to anybody who's willing to join our fantasy league here at the Spread, we have no kicker and we're an extra flex player, so you can play an extra wide receiver, tight end, or running back. So these guys are all more valuable. F kickers, dude. They're worthless.
I don't like the... Well, obviously, I told you to get rid of the kicker. I've told you about that rule, but I just don't like the extra flex. But whatever, let's just...
Well, what else are you going to make it?
You don't have to make it anything. You just remove kickers and that's it.
No, throw in another guy.
Well, that depletes...
Just makes it harder. You have to be more skilled at who you pick.
Well, I'm just saying that depletes free agency and everything else. I mean, you're just adding an extra player that you have to choose from in free agency and whatnot, but it don't matter, whatever. Let's move on to...
Skilled.
Yeah, here... All right, let's move on. Number 12, Demaryius Thomas, wide receiver of the Denver Broncos. 184 targets last season.
This guy.
111 receptions. I like Demaryius Thomas.
No, 1,600 in the playoffs.
1,619 yards, 11 touchdowns. He had 7 or more receptions 10 times, 5 or more receptions 13 times. He had double-digit receptions 3 times. 10 100-yard games, including 226 yards versus Arizona and 171 versus San Fran, and he had 3 multi-TD games. And he's the number 1 receiver out there in Denver still, and even though Peyton Manning is probably going to take a little bit of a step down this season, like I said, I still think Demaryius Thomas is going to be one of the best receivers in fantasy this year, and that's why I have him as my second fantasy wide receiver.
I'm surprised you got him over Dez Bryant. They both just got the big deal. Dez got a little bit of a bigger contract. Not why I'm surprised you have him above that. I just think Bryant has more opportunities for touchdowns than Thomas does. But I like Thomas even here at number 12 because Just like you said, he's the number one guy in Denver. They do have Emmanuel Sanders on the other side, but they got rid of Julius Thomas, so the targets are going to be there for Demaryius Thomas.
Yeah, I'll mention why Des Bryant is not as high as he is on my list when we get to him here in a minute.
He's the highest one on this list.
Yeah, probably. Let's move on to number 13, though. Kelvin Johnson, wide receiver from Detroit. Now, this guy, he had some injury problems last season, and he didn't have the biggest season for fantasy owners, but he still ended up with 71 receptions, had 128 targets, still got over 1,000 yards with 1,077, and he had 8 touchdowns in 13 games. He had double-digit targets 9 times, 5 100-yard games, still 3 140-yard games. He had 164 versus the Giants and 158 versus Tampa. He had 6 games with less than 60 yards receiving, though, and that's where the injury problems came up, and the fact that Detroit was kind of inconsistent last season. Stafford didn't have the best season last year. I expect him to be a little bit better, but Kelvin Johnson, 3 multi-TD games last year and 5 TD over his final 5 games, so you can see Stafford and Kelvin Johnson kind of got on the same page late in the season.
I don't want to call him a question mark. Maybe I'll call him a wild card. But he is the one guy on this list that could blow up and dominate every single person as far as fantasy points.
That's why
he's the only wide receiver that I think has the potential to get 2,000 yards in a season. And I'm not saying anything bad about any of the other guys, but he's a freak in nature in his size. And we've seen him do it before, almost set the receiving record. So yeah, Johnson probably won't blow up like that. He's getting a little older. He may have slowed down just a tiny bit or whatever, but he is the one wild card out of this list that could blow us all out of the water and prove us all wrong because he's crazy.
Well, I mean, that's why I still have him at number 13 here. I mean, he had the inconsistent offense last season, so you're not 100% sure he's going to have the huge blow-up season, but he also has the talent to be the best wide receiver here. And even if he's not, he's still going to give you good stats. He's still going to score touchdowns for you. So it's worth the shot of grabbing him here early and not letting him fall too far.
Yeah, I'd scoop him up.
All right, let's move on to number 14 here. Julio Jones. A lot of people have him as the number 2 wide receiver behind Antonio Brown.
Roddy White's dropping off a little bit.
Yeah, please believe. And Julio Jones had 164 targets last season. That's almost 40 more than Kelvin Johnson got. He ended up with 104 receptions for 1,593 yards, although he only found the end zone 6 times. But he did have 7 100-yard games. He had 3 160-yard games, including 259 at Green Bay and 189 versus Arizona. And he had no less than 56 yards receiving in any game all season. So, along with Antonio Brown, he was one of the most consistent wide receivers last season. And the 6 touchdowns he scored last year, I see no reason why that won't go up this season. Matt Ryan knows how to score. I mean, Atlanta's offense can score touchdowns. I think Julio Jones is going to score a lot more this season while putting up similar stats. So, he's going to have a big year for you.
He's a good receiver who makes freak catches, and he's definitely the best player on their offense, so there's no reason to believe any different.
So what we have here is Antonio Brown, Demaryius Thomas, Kelvin Johnson, and Julio Jones as the top 4 wide receiver. Who is going to be number 5? At number 15 here, Odell Beckham Jr., wide receiver from the New York Giants.
Beast catches.
This guy
I think he uses Stickum.
This guy is a monster. The only reason he is not up near Antonio Brown right now, because he was just as consistent as Brown. He only played 12 games. It was his rookie season, so we'll have to see. This is his second year. He could take a small step down, but this guy is a monster, and he's definitely a top 5 wide receiver in my mind. Look,
just got to hope his hammies stay together.
He catches a high percentage of his targets, man. 91 receptions and 132 targets. He had 1,305 yards and 12 touchdowns in 12 games. This dude dominated nonstop when he became the number 1 wide receiver. He had 4 multi-TD games, 7 touchdowns over his final 4 games, 90 or more yards receiving in each of his final 9 games. He had 7 100-yard games, 5 140-yard games, including 185 yards versus Philly. And he had 10 or more targets 7 times, 15 or more targets 3 times, 21 targets versus Philly on December 28th.
Who did he make the sick catch in the end zone against? Do you remember? I don't remember who it was because who cares who it was against?
Yeah, I don't remember who it
beast.
Was. It was beast mode, and this guy is one of the top wide receivers in the NFL. And if you get any one of those top 5, and there's even more receivers here, including our next guy, Des Bryant, I mean, there's even more. Jordy Nelson, he's another guy. There are a lot of wide receivers here that you can fill out your lineup with.
You know what I think's going to make Beckham a little better this year? Victor Cruz. I think Victor Cruz is going to take another step forward after being injured last year, and they're going to have to focus on him because he's no slouch. And you're not going to be able to double up Beckham like they thought they were going to do, towards the end of last year and everything. So I think Cruz having a bigger year is really going to help Beckham. And Eli knows how to get the ball to playmakers. I mean, I like to hate on him because he's all ho-hum and weird back there. But he gets the job done. 2 Super Bowl victories. You can't really complain.
Yeah, he had, I wouldn't say a down year last year. He was very inconsistent last year. I expect him to have a rebound season anyways. Eli Manning's going to have a decent season, and he has 2 very good receivers to get the ball to. And Odell Beckham is going to have a huge year, I believe. Let's move on to number 16, Dez Bryant, wide receiver from Dallas. So there's your Dez Bryant.
Make money, make money, money.
Look, he only had 88 receptions last year on 138 targets, but he did score 16 touchdowns. Now,
you should have had 17, too. Remember when he got ripped off on that one?
Yeah, I don't think he got ripped off, though. I think it was oh, no, that was that. Yeah, that was weird. I forget.
Yeah, on that 4th down call when it was like 4th and inches and they threw it deep.
Because his foot touched the ground and it looked like he was pushing off. I forget what happened.
It was just stupid. That's all you need to know.
But anyways, he scored 16 touchdowns. I don't know if he's going to do that again, man. It's hard to score 16 touchdowns in back-to-back seasons. And Tony Romo had a huge season, but you got to remember they had DeMarco Murray there
allowed
too.
All that to happen.
Exactly, man. So you said you wanted Dez Bryant up there higher. I'm not so sure, man, because I don't see as many touchdowns. And Dez Bryant, he has some inconsistencies about him too. I don't see Dallas's offense being as good as they were last season. I mean, they were never really that good with Tony Romo under center.
Garbage.
I don't see them getting better with the loss of DeMarco Murray and the addition of Darren McFadden.
Darren McFadden's beast, dude. He had like 2 good years his whole career.
He was beast for a moment at least. But I mean, Dez Bryant still had a huge season last year, and he's still one of the top 10 wide receivers at least. I mean, top 5 on some people's boards. And I have no problem drafting him high in the 2nd round or even late in the 1st round if you feel like that's your guy.
If you're thug life, you like Dez Bryant.
Look, he had 12 TDs over his final 9 games, 6 touchdowns over his final 3 games. He can go off at times, so that's why he's up here. Let's move on to number 17, though. Another beast wide receiver. This is a guy I never really liked, but he keeps getting it done. Jordy Nelson of the Green Bay Packers. Last season, on 151 targets, he had 98 catches for 1,519 yards and 13 touchdowns.
He's the one guy I think that can challenge Brown for the catch lead this year, because Aaron Rodgers is going to put up mad points and mad touchdowns again this year, and Nelson is a catching machine. I hate him.
Yeah, he's a beast. I mean, he's 6'3", and Aaron Rodgers is one of the most consistent quarterbacks in all of football. So you know Jordy Nelson's going to put up points for you nearly week in and week out. Maybe not as consistent as Antonio Brown or Julio Jones, but he still puts up huge numbers. And he
has the chance for that big, huge game, though. Not saying Brown or anybody doesn't, but you'll see Nelson have 20 catches and 3 touchdowns in one game out of the blue.
Please believe. And talking about consistency, look, 8 or more receptions 7 times, 5 or more receptions 11 times, 7 100-yard games, including 209 yards versus the Jets, 10 games with 80 or more yards receiving, and he didn't go 2 straight games without scoring all season. So that's what consistency is, and he is one of the best wide receivers to own in fantasy, and you can trust him just as much as you can trust anybody on this list.
Let's face it, I mean, you could trust any of these players in these first 25.
Please believe. Let's move on to number 18 here.
First quarterback
off the list.
Woo!
I'm going to go with Andrew Luck here of the Indianapolis Colts.
5,000 yards this year. I'm calling it.
We already threw for 4,700 last year, so it wouldn't surprise me at all. He threw 40 touchdowns last year, had 16 interceptions. He also added 273 yards rushing with 3 rushing touchdowns as well. I think that actually tied for the team lead.
I want to know how Aaron Rodgers won the MVP and Luck didn't. I know Rodgers threw less picks, but I don't know. Luck is the Colts.
Yeah, but Aaron Rodgers is pretty much the Green Bay Packers too, and Aaron Rodgers is a very consistent quarterback. Andrew Luck was a little bit more inconsistent last season than Aaron Rodgers, but Andrew Luck, another year older, another year in the NFL. I think he's just going to get better this season. And you look last year, 10 300-yard games, 6 games with at least 370 yards. and he had 400 yards against the Pittsburgh Steelers. He had 7 games with 3 or more TDs, 13 games with 2 or more, and he had a 5-touchdown game versus Washington. He had 32 or more attempts 13 times and 41 or more attempts 8 times. So this dude's throwing the ball all over the field. They brought in Andre Johnson to replace Reggie Wayne. They still have T.Y. Hilton. They drafted Philip Dorsett, and they still have Dante Moncrief.
And Frank Gore.
Yes, they have Frank Gore in the backfield as well. He winds up being in our top 50 as well. So does Andre Johnson. So does T.Y. Hilton. So this offense should be even better than they were last season, if you ask me.
Yeah, Luck's beast. We don't really need to go into too much detail. If you need to be told Luck is one of the top 3 fantasy QBs, you shouldn't be playing fantasy.
Yeah, but where should you draft him, man? That's the real question. Should you take him instead of a Jordy Nelson, Des Bryant type receiver?
In a 10-team league?
Nah, well, I like 12-team leagues.
Okay, so if we're in a 12-team league, if I have a mid-round pick, I would take him in the 2nd round. If I had a high pick, I might try to wait till he slips to the 3rd.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying here. That's exactly why I have him at 18, right in the middle of the 2nd round, because I'm not taking him over Jordy Nelson or Des Bryant. These receivers are more valuable to you than grabbing Andrew Luck right now. When you can find another decent quarterback later in the draft if you miss out on Luck, whereas you're not going to find wide receivers like those big-time guys later in this draft.
You don't have to be a good quarterback to be a good fantasy quarterback. It's the one position where a journeyman can get you more points than anywhere else. And I'm not saying like in one game, because that can happen to anybody. But like Ryan Fitzpatrick has had a huge fantasy year. He wasn't any good, but he threw the hell out of the ball and he threw some touchdowns. So yeah, you definitely got to go for a really, really good position player first. You want to fill up running back and wide receiver, at least one of each, before you start going after a quarterback.
Well, like you said, though, you'd take him in the 2nd round.
I mean,
right?
It depends on if everybody was gone. If the top 5 running backs and the top 5 receivers are gone and I get a chance to get the number 1 quarterback, then maybe I do it.
That's what I'm saying. That's why I have Andrew Luck here, because the next guys on the list are A.J. Green and Randall Cobb. That's just a step down at the wide receiver position, and you got to grab those top quarterbacks. I mean, it's still better to have the top quarterbacks here than to wait for a Russell Wilson or a Drew Brees a little bit later. It just depends on what receivers are there and what quarterbacks are there. But Aaron Rodgers, he's just as reliable, if not more reliable, than Andrew Luck's going to be this season, obviously. And if you decided you wanted Aaron Rodgers over Andrew Luck, I wouldn't have a problem with that either. He had a big season last year, 4,381 yards, 38 TDs compared to 5 picks, and he had 269 yards rushing with 2 rushing touchdowns. So he adds a little bit in the run game as well.
Yeah, he's mobile for a white boy.
And here's his consistency. 8 300-yard games, including 418 yards at New Orleans. He had 8 games with 3 or more TDs, 11 games with 2 or more TDs. He had a 6-touchdown game versus Chicago, and he had 27 or more attempts 13 times. And let's not forget, he has 2 of the top 25 players at wide receiver between Nelson and Cobb, and then he also has a top 10 player in Eddie Lacy as well. So he has huge weapons around him. And Aaron Rodgers, like I said, one of the most consistent quarterbacks in football. This whole Green Bay offense is going to be beast this season.
He's the MVP. That's all you need to know, folks.
All right, let's move on to number 20 then. A.J. Green, wide receiver from Cincinnati. Now, he had somewhat of a down year last season. Scored just 6 touchdowns and had just 69 receptions.
He has Andy Griffith throwing him the ball. Andy Dalton.
But look, he still had 116 targets and 1,041 yards, so it wasn't a complete loss for him, and he only played 13 games as well. So if he is able to stay healthy and play a full 16 games, those numbers are going to go up. I expect Andy Dalton to be a little more consistent this season. I mean, he's shown it in the past. He was okay last season, but he had very, very bad games where no one on the team was going to give you any fantasy value whatsoever. And then he had his big games. I think he's going to even that out a little bit this season. But A.J. Green still had a good season last year. 5 100-yard games, including 224 versus your Pittsburgh Steelers there, Jim.
Who's going to shut him down against Pittsburgh this year?
6 or more receptions, just 6 times, though. And he had double-digit receptions 2 times. 9 or more targets 7 times. The targets were still there. They just weren't coming up with the catches. He wasn't running.
Because Andy Dalton's garbage.
He's not that bad, man. AJ Green's going to have a bigger year this year.
Definitely a better year.
Yeah, he had a little bit of injury problems last season. He's going to have a big season, and I wouldn't let this guy fall too far.
It's a contract year for AJ Green, too.
Please believe.
So he's going to be going out there trying to catch everything, even herpes.
All right, number 21, Randall Cobb, wide receiver from Green Bay, the second Green Bay wide receiver
on the
already.
Cobb. Yeah, how do those two receivers have 90-plus receptions for you in the same year? That's just ridiculous.
That's why Aaron Rodgers is an MVP, man.
He's garbage. He has a stupid mustache.
But look at this. 91 catches on 126 targets. This guy runs high percentage routes, 1,287 yards and 12 touchdowns. He had 5 or more receptions 10 times, 5 100-yard games, 120 or more yards in 4 of those, and he had 131 yards versus Tampa for his season high. He had 10 touchdowns in his first 9 games before a 6-game scoring drought, but then he scored 2 TDs in his final game, and he had double-digit targets 4 times during that 6-game scoring drought, so he was still being thrown at a ton. This guy is going to see targets every game, and he also got 11 carries on the season, so you might get a couple points out of him on the ground. But Randall Cobb, he's going to be one of the most reliable receivers just because you got Aaron Rodgers out there, and you got Jordy Nelson on the other side, and you're going to have a great run game with Eddie Lacy at running back, like I said. So Randall Cobb, I have no reason but to trust him this season. And if you wanted to take him over A.J. Green, I'd completely understand that as well, since A.J. Green was a little bit inconsistent last season. But I just think Green's going to have a big season. We've seen it from him before with Andy Dalton, nonetheless. And I think he's going to have a little bit better season. But Randall Cobb, he's one of those guys I like.
Cobb returns
He's going to have a ton
too,
of catches.
Doesn't he? I think he does.
I don't know if he still returns catches. I mean, he's very important to this offense now, so I don't know if he's going to return punts for him anymore or not.
Hey, if Antonio Brown's doing
that's
it,
scary to me, too. I don't know if they're going to let him do that much longer either. All right, let's move on to number 22 here. Alshon Jeffrey of the Chicago Bears. Now, number 1 wide receiver last season, Brandon Marshall, is gone, although you can argue that Alshon Jeffrey was the number 1 wide receiver last season. I mean, he had the better season. 85 receptions on 145 targets, 1,133 yards with 10 touchdowns, 5 receptions or more 10 times, double-digit targets 5 times, 7 touchdowns over his final 7 games. He had 3 100-yard games, plus 95 yards at Dallas, 97 yards at Carolina. And this guy, I mean, they brought in Kevin White, so they still brought in another good wide receiver on the other side. But now Alshon Jeffrey is definitely the number 1 wide receiver in Chicago. And as bad as they're going to be, maybe, who knows if they're going to be good or not. Teams turning around from year to year. But whether they're good or bad, you get a lot of production in terms of fantasy out of Chicago players because Jay Cutler slings the ball around so much.
Jeffrey can go deep, and Cutler's good at the deep ball. He's got a really strong arm. Nobody's ever questioned that. So if Jeffrey can get behind the defense a couple times throughout the year, that'll help him out. And like you said, they brought in Kevin White. He's another guy who can scare the defense with his speed. So, I mean, Cutler's going to be slinging it everywhere with Mike Martz at offensive coordinator. Whether he can get it to the receiver, that's the question.
Well, he always has before, man. There's no question. I mean, look, he got this guy the ball 85 times last season.
He got benched for Jimmy Clausen last year.
I understand. That's the thing, though. I mean, Jay Cutler is not the greatest quarterback, but in terms of fantasy, man, he puts the ball in the hands of people around him in the end. But Alshon Jeffrey, he had a minor AC joint injury recently, but he is expected to be healthy for the season, so there's no reason not to draft him here at number 22.
Man, when my air conditioning joint goes bad, I don't know what I'm going to do.
Number 23, T.Y. Hilton of the Indianapolis Colts, the 11th wide receiver on the board here.
Take him. That's all you need to know.
82 receptions last season on 130 targets, 1,345 yards with 7 touchdowns, 5 or more receptions 10 times. There's that consistency you want to see. 9 or more receptions 3 times. He had double-digit targets 6 times. 19 targets at Cleveland. That's a huge amount of targets. He had 6 100-yard games, 3 150-yard games, including 223 yards at Houston last season. All 7 of his TDs came over his final 10 games, so you can see him and Andrew Luck started to get on the same page towards the end of the season. Now, they brought over Andre Johnson to replace Reggie Wayne this year. Reggie Wayne had a down season last year, and T.Y. Hilton was still a beast. With Andre Johnson having any kind of better of a season than Reggie Wayne had last season, this should just only help T.Y. Hilton in the end.
think Hilton's in a contract year too, and he's going to want to be proving something big because this is his first shot at a big contract coming in after the rookie wage scale. And I think he steps up and takes the number one wide receiver position for the Colts very easily in that wide receiver group. And him and Luck have a good rapport, so it wouldn't surprise me to see him catch 100 passes this year.
Yeah, and like we said, whatever improvements Luck shows this season from last, it's only going to help T.Y. Hilton in the end as
Believe
well.
it.
So T.Y. Hilton is definitely a guy I got on my radar here in the top 2 rounds.
I like him way better than your next guy.
Emmanuel Sanders? You don't like Emmanuel Sanders?
I just don't like him. He called out Ben's leadership qualities. I think that was punk. That's locker room stuff that doesn't need to be talked about outside of the locker room.
Well, I mean, he definitely had a better season with Peyton Manning. I'll give him that.
Well,
Number 24 on the
there.
list, Emmanuel Sanders of the Denver Broncos we're talking about here. 101 receptions on 141 targets, 1,404 yards and 9 touchdowns. He had 5 or more receptions 12 times, man. 8 or more receptions 5 times, double-digit receptions 2 times, and he had 7 100-yard games, including 151 at New England and 149 at Seattle. He had 3 multi-TD games. This guy is a beast, dude.
He's a punk.
I'm definitely taking him in the top 2 rounds, man. If you pass him, I'll love it.
Hey, I'm not saying he's not a good fantasy wide receiver. I'm just saying he's a punk.
Well, that's cool. You can say he's a punk all you want.
I take guys
Don't
with
draft
good
him.
character issue or good character.
Yeah, the hell you do. You don't give a crap about that.
What do you mean? I don't take guys with bad character. Kid me? Just because Ray Rice and Michael Vick were on my team at the same time.
Yeah, exactly. And then let's round it out here with number 25 overall, running back for the Cincinnati Bengals, Jeremy Hill.
Interesting here to be at 25.
Listen, I had to drop him some because I'm not 100% sold on this guy, but a lot of people have him as a top 12 pick and want him to go in the first round. I'm not trusting Jeremy Hill with my first pick overall quite yet. I have to see a full season out of him before I say I'm going to take him as my fantasy beast for the season. I mean,
No way I take that guy number 1 overall. Who's the guy that he shares carries with? That little dude.
Giovanni
Love him.
Bernard.
Yeah.
Well, first of all, Jeremy Hill is a much better running back than Giovanni Bernard. Maybe not in the passing game, although he came up with 27 catches for 215 yards this season. But Jeremy Hill was a beast on the ground last year. He had 1,124 yards with 9 rushing touchdowns, but he had 8 carries or less in 5 of his first 6 games and had 10 carries in his 7th game. So it wasn't really until game 8 when they started featuring him, and he still got over 1,000 yards. Over his last 9 games, he had 18 or more carries in 6 of those. He had 5 100-yard games, including 147 or more in 4 of those. He had 154 versus Jacksonville, 152 at New Orleans, and he had 6 of his 9 TDs over those final 9 games. And look, over his final 3 games even, 395 yards rushing with 3 touchdowns. This dude was crushing it last season. Really, he was one of the best fantasy running backs to own towards the end of the season going into the playoffs last year. That's why he's a first-round pick on most people's boards. But I'm not going to completely trust it yet. There's other running backs out there that I'd rather have. We already talked about. And some of these wide receivers, you know, are going to have huge seasons. I trust them a little bit more than Jeremy Hill right now. But I would not be mad if Jeremy Hill was my number 1 running back. I just don't want him to be my number 1 pick.
I take him number 2 running back at best.
Well, that's going to be tough, man, because there's not many good running backs out there right now. We named the top 9. I have Jeremy Hill at number 10 right now. And I'm not sold on number 9 either, LaShawn McCoy. And you look after him here, who we're going to do in our next segment. And, I mean, you got Mark Ingram coming up soon. If that's a guy you want to trust as your number 1 running back.
If Arian Foster was healthy, this list would look a little different, but that punk ass had to go and tear his groin and need surgery.
Please believe. And we'll be talking about Arian Foster somewhat soon.
Yeah,
but we're going to
in
move
the
on.
bottom 100.
We're going to move on to 26 through 50 here after this segment's over, and you're going to hear about guys like Drew Brees, Peyton Manning, and young wide receiver Mike Evans.
Drew Brees falling off, losing it. He's getting old. His arm's going to fall off.
Well, he was inconsistent last season, really inconsistent, and losing Jimmy Graham, he is not a first-round pick to me anymore, and I'm going to probably wait until the 3rd round to grab that guy.
Agreed. Anything else you got to say about these top 25?
No, but look, if you have the first pick overall, you got Le'Veon Bell, and then you're coming back, you're going to have the 24th and 25th pick. You're going to come back and grab Emmanuel Sanders and Jeremy Hill. I think that's a nice start to have Le'Veon Bell, Jeremy Hill, and Emmanuel Sanders if you got the first pick overall. And if you have the 12th pick and the 13th pick, I mean, you're sitting there with Demaryius Thomas and Rob Gronkowski. That's a nice start as well.
Beast mode through the air. If you can't get running backs, draft wide receiver heavy and trade. But that's all we got for you for the top 25 fantasy players. Don't forget, Dash said we're going to be doing the next 25 right now after this. So you guys can follow us on Twitter at bet_the_spread or follow me on Twitter at betjimthewin if you got anything to say about it. Check out the Facebook page at facebook.com/betthespread. Keep coming to the YouTube page. Keep subscribing. Keep liking.